In this project, we're going to put our senior taken on a gray background onto a new background. Now in this case, I just want to mention one thing, and that's to point out that you don't have to have a crazy multiple light setup. This is a very small roll of gray paper, and there's only one light. You can see the softbox here coming from this angle, and that's all there is. I'm okay with the fact that is cast a bit of shadow here because I'm going to make my selection of her separately. As for the background image, this is one of the backgrounds that I'm creating for this website, Backgrounds for Compositing, where you have the two photographs. So the first thing we want to do is edit our background image as a Camera Raw Smart Object. I've selected both of them. I just did that by clicking on one, then shift clicking on there, double click to open both. So these will both open in Camera Raw. I'm going to do this over here on the side, select all, synchronize, and that just means when I click OK, whatever I do to one image will happen to both. So I want to lower the exposure, take some of those highlights down a little bit and the whites down a little bit, and let's push up the clarity a little bit, and most importantly, we're going to crank the vibrance a little bit because we really want to have a nice colorful background image in here. The other thing I could choose to do, I like the old-fashioned look, so having the tire or wheel of a newer car in there, not so much. So let's take our crop tool and we're going to just crop it like this. Let's pull this down just a bit like that. When I hit enter, it will crop both images because again they have been synchronized. At this point I will open both objects, and that means it will open both documents independently in Photoshop, which I want to combine together. So I'm going to take this photo here with our reference person, drag it over, hold down the shift key and let go. And what that does is it makes these two images line up perfectly. Now if you felt like they weren't lining up perfectly, you could select both of them and then use a command called auto align layers. Unfortunately that doesn't work when it's a smart object. Luckily, because these two photographs are taken on a tripod, when I drag over with the shift key they are perfectly lined up. And honestly, even if they're not perfectly lined, but if they're close enough, the main purpose of this layer is to position the person and take a look at any shadows and things of that nature. Okay, in this case let's use Mini Bridge to get our photograph. So we'll have to find the senior folder. There she is. Drag her in. As we know now, that will open it at first in Camera Raw. Once again here, I'm just kind of looking at the background and trying to think how can I help do a better job for my selection tool. So I'm going to move some settings here with the goal in mind of helping the quick selection tool do a better job. Click OK. Prepares a smart object. Now we can position her. Now one nice little trick is when you're trying to figure out, I'm trying to use the reference person, and I'm going to keep calling it the reference person even though you and I know it's me, and what I want to do is see the other person in the background. So if you lower the opacity, and that's while those free transform handles are still showing, now I can hold down the shift key and scale down a bit. I'm 6 feet tall, so basically I know that Zan is shorter than that. Something like this. Click OK. Click enter, and then put the opacity back up again. At this point I would hide both of the other layers so I can concentrate my attention on making my selection. So quick selection tool. This part is nothing new. And all we're going to try and do here is make an accurate selection. I usually start off by doing the overall selection kind of zoomed out like this, just so I can make sure looks like I've got a pretty good start. Then I'll get closer in. So start to zoom in closer and see what we've got here. I actually prefer when there's a shadow like this, I'm going to include it, because rather than trying to artificially paint shadows, if you can use one that's already there, that's a good thing. So we'll use that in our image. Here I don't want this gray between her legs, so I'm going to hold down Option or Alt and click. The chances are it might not get everything, and while I could zoom in even closer and try and get it, at this point I would probably just press L for lasso tool, pull down Option or Alt and just go in here and say, I do not want this area here. And sometimes that's just easier to switch tools than it is to spend forever zooming in and zooming out. So press W to get back to the quick selection tool, and now we just want to add that extra bit in there. Missed a bit on her elbow. And this is really the crucial part. The refine edge, remember, is just going to make the edge itself more refined. It won't help if we're missing things completely. So I just did Option or Alt to get rid of most of that gray. Now I'm going to try and get some of this hair back in. I'm not going to try and get right to the very edge though, because that's what refine edge will do for me. Up here it looks pretty good in her hair. There's a few little flyaway hairs here and there, but again, that's what refine edge is for. The only thing I might consider doing, and I'm going to zoom in closer just so I can see, I had a feeling there's a little tiny bit of gray in there. I'm just going to use the lasso tool again with Option or Alt held down to get rid of that little part. Back to the quick selection tool to fine-tune this edge. And I didn't mention it, but all the time I have Auto Enhance turned on for the quick selection tool. Unless you're working with really, really big files, I recommend leaving that on because it's going to give you a more accurate selection. It might slow things down just a hair, but I'm okay with that. And sometimes it's very common to have to do this idea where you add a bit, take away a bit, trying to get to a better place in terms of the quality. So that looks pretty good to me. At this point I would turn on my background layer and click Refine Edge. Usually what should happen is it should remember the last one I used is On Layers. In this example I'm going to mention that you'll see in brackets L and K. What that means is as you're working, if you want to temporarily see it as the mask, you press K, press L to get back to that On Layers command. And once again I'll mention that don't forget at this point we're simply looking at the edge. Don't be distracted by the fact the colors might be a little too bright or whatever it may be. At this point we're just really looking at edges. So I'm going to use the Refine Radius tool on the edge here, try and pick up a few more little hairs here and also in here. So I'm just painting over these areas to try and add those in. And as long as I see something, if it's got some gray in it, that's okay. And again, I just pressed K and L to kind of look and see what I had here. A little bit more painting. I think that's looking pretty good. I'm quite happy with that already. Now I do see a little tiny bit of an edge here, so I would probably tend to shift this edge just a little bit. Personally, I'm not too quick to go on this decontaminate colors. I'll show you in a minute what I mean by that. So for now, I'm just going to leave it at that and go to Layer Mask. So now let me show you what I mean by that decontaminate colors and what it does. I'm going to duplicate this whole thing and then we'll go to the Mask Properties panel and do Mask Edge on Layers. And if I choose decontaminate colors, watch the little fringe here. The good news is it often will get rid of the fringe there. The problem is, see, look at what it's doing to her hair. So you have to kind of balance between this, and this is where, and look at even over here in her hand, we're losing part of it. So you have to be a little careful about this. It's a good concept to say remove that little bit of a fringe, but overall I'm going to suggest that a lot of the time you may not be happy with the results. It also, I discovered, does some bad things to the original background color, so if you do end up trying to mask anything, you might have some kind of weirdness happening there as well. So at this point, let's try and get her matching the background a little bit. I'm going to change the color temperature. This was taken with indoors with a flash, a strobe. So I want to try and match her up a little bit better. Clarity is usually not something that's a great idea for a female, just because it tends to accentuate texture in her skin and things of that nature. So I'm going to pull that back a little bit. That was really just to help me make a better selection. So that's looking a little more like it in terms of the color tone because she's in the sunlight, so that's a good start. Now here, I'm going to just nudge her down a little bit. I think I want to move her over a little bit. One of the things we talked about in one of our earlier sessions is, take a look over here. When I go to fit in window, see that little line that looks like it's there, but when I go to actual size, it really isn't. That's just a screen display kind of thing, but just to be safe, I normally like to take my marquee tool, just make sure by filling that with black on the mask, just so I have more than enough, so I'm not going to worry what if I change something and I suddenly see these areas that I don't want to be there. Let's take a look down here. Remember, it said that we want to include that shadow. The problem with it is right now the shadow doesn't look very realistic because every other shadow looks like this. So I'm going to take my quick selection tool once again. Let's just click on the layer. And I want to try to get just the shadow. And it may turn out that I have to just do it manually with like the lasso tool. So let me switch to the lasso tool and just try and get this. What I want to do is get just the shadow in here. Like that. Let's get rid of just this one tiny little bit of her shoe. Now this takes a couple of steps to do this. First of all, I'm going to press Command or Control J. That's going to duplicate just that little shadow. Then I'm going to load this as a selection, Command or Control click on it, go back to the layer mask and fill that with black. Now you can't tell right now, but when you look at it this way, you'll see that it's disappeared. So what I've effectively done is moved the shadow onto its own layer and hidden it on here. So this way, part of the reason for doing that is now I can change the blend mode to multiply, so it starts to have that see-through nature of the shadow the way we want it to. And I also want to try to match up this color a little better. Now when you use the eyedropper and click on the shadow color, that's the full shadow color. However, if I were to fill that on here and multiply, it's a little too dark. Now I could lower the opacity a little bit. That's actually not bad. And I think I would drag this down below just to make sure if it's behind her. So that's already a pretty good start. Now by habit, I did that without mentioning the keyboard shortcut. What I did there, after I chose the other shadow color, I knew I had these pixels on a layer by themselves, so I did the keyboard shortcut. Option Delete, let's put it this way, I'll describe it a little better hopefully. Option Delete or Alt Backspace is the shortcut for fill, but that would fill the whole layer. All I wanted to fill were the pixels that were already there, so in that case, Option Shift Delete or Alt Shift Backspace. Now you could, just so you know, you could also do it this way, fill with foreground color, preserve transparency. So that's the same basic concept. Now I'm going to add another new layer, and I'm just going to temporarily show this other one to kind of figure out, okay, this appears to be the angle, something like this, so let's just do it this way. This is really just for reference sake. I'm going to try to roughly match that shadow, just so I know if we move this over here, this is kind of the angle that shadow should be. In this case, I can just do Option Delete or Alt Backspace because I have a selection, and then we change the blend mode to multiply and try and lower the opacity. Now I would probably, no, not probably, I would delete where the shadow overlaps because then it gets too dark. And I want to just blur this just a little bit, not a lot, because I want to match the other shadow that's there. So I don't want to blur the edge too much because this edge doesn't really have that much of a blur. Just a little bit, maybe a bit. Something like that perhaps. That's looking a little better. I think we're pretty close to the result that I want. I do want to consider at least the idea we talked about in one of the other classes of matching the light. So I'm going to take a soft edge brush. Let's get a little closer in here. And just along the edge of her arm, and maybe this side of her face, this inside of her arm, and also along her leg. And remember, the technique now is we want to clip this, so Option or Alt click between the two layers, first of all, to make it only visible in those areas. Then we try a blend mode, like perhaps overlay, and then lower the opacity. So we're just adding that little bit of more highlight. I'm not exactly sold on the part on her hair, so I think I might take my eraser tool, I've got it set at 50% opacity, and just maybe erase some of that because that looks a little bit too much, and I'm also not a big fan of that part right there. This is, I think, a really good example of a couple of things. First of all, don't make too many decisions based on either looking up really close or really far away, because when I look from the zoomed out view, I think that looks a little artificial, but when I looked at it at the actual size, it doesn't look too bad at all to me. It looks pretty good. The other thing I would remind you of is that when you're working on a project like this and you spend too much time staring at your screen, here's my suggestion. Save it, and then close it and work on something else, and then come back sometime later and revisit it with a new kind of fresh eyes, shall we say, to see if you like it or not. As long as you're saving it as a PSD, you have access to all this information. One little side note, you don't need to, but once this reference photograph has served its purpose, you could actually delete it because you don't really need it anymore. But remember, the bottom line about our approach we're taking here is everything is still, even at this point, editable. So I could go into the background, double click to go back to camera raw and say, I want to lower the exposure just a little more, and click OK. And then I want to also go into our model, Zan, and lower that exposure a little bit as well. So this could be a week later, it could be after you printed it that you realize when you print it doesn't look the way you want. That's the benefit of using Camera Raw Smart Objects, layer masks, and saving as a PSD, is all these things can be edited.